This life-taker didn't just take lives, he erased entire families. A drifter who turned kindness into death sentences, leaving a trail of blood across 13 states. The most chilling part? His victims often invited him inside their homes. Wait until you hear his last words. They'll freeze your blood. Born on June 28, 1964, in Oakland, California, Tommy Lindsels entered a world already teetering on the edge of dysfunction. He was one of 5 children, but the child he was tethered to most closely was Tammy Jean, his twin sister. And when Tammy died from meningitis before her 2nd birthday, that tether was severed in a way that didn't just hurt, it mutilated his psyche. Tommy survived the disease that took her, but something inside him withered with her death. That formative loss became the seed of a warped tree whose branches would stretch into the darkest corners of America. The family was a blueprint for collapse. His mother, Nina Sells, was a woman sinking into instability, mentally fractured, emotionally absent, and desperately unfit to nurture any child, let alone 5. Home was not a sanctuary. It was a rotating carousel of relatives, chaos, and survival. The air Tommy breathed was thick with poverty. The floors he slept on were cold with apathy, and the future he faced was blank with despair. There was no safety net, no discipline, no affection, only the disintegration of innocence. It was not long before he sought escape, and that escape came through intoxication. At 7, Tommy Lindsels began drinking alcohol. At 10, it began smoking. By 14, LSD had taken root in his bloodstream. He dropped out of school, fled the instability of home, and disappeared into America's underbelly. He hopped trains, stole food, lived under bridges, and blended into the crowds of carnivals like a ghost wearing a smile. Drugs became the language he spoke fluently, and violence became the accent that followed him everywhere. His descent was not a stumble, it was a nosedive. But trauma alone doesn't forge a life-taker. Somewhere along the line, Tommy Lindsels ceased to merely react to pain and began inflicting it with deliberate cruelty. He would later allege that a family acquaintance named Willis Clark had molested him during these years, and whether that claim was true or another of his countless manipulations, it became a permanent fixture in his narrative. He told the story often, not with sorrow, but with something close to calculation. Even in recounting victimhood, Tommy Lindsels remained the author of his own myth, a man who twisted the truth until it screamed. His first confession of life-taking came at age 15. According to his own telling, he stumbled upon a man molesting a boy and beat the perpetrator to death in a fury. No body was ever found. No case matched his details. But the story, whether real or imaginary, was rehearsed with pride. For Tommy, being a life-taker was a badge, not a burden. And it would not be the last time he wore that badge. He wandered without direction, but with an inner compass that pointed only to carnage. His victims were scattered across the United States. Strangers, women, children, men, none connected by any pattern save for their fatal proximity to him. In 1985, he murdered 35-year-old Anna Court and drowned her 4-year-old son Rory in the bathtub. The motive, according to his later confession, was that Anna reminded him of his mother. That same year, he punctured 19-year-old Fabian Witherspoon 18 times after she offered him food and shelter. She survived. He did not escape. He was caught, imprisoned, diagnosed with bipolar disorder and antisocial personality disorder, then released after only 2 years. 2 years for an attempted murder that would have unalived anyone else. But the darkest pages of Tommy Lindsels' story were yet to be written. The Dardeen family massacre in November 1987 stands as one of the most depraved crimes in modern American memory. Keith Dardeen, his pregnant wife Elaine, and their 3-year-old son Peter were found slain in their home in Illinois. Keith had been fired. Elaine, beaten to death with a bat. Peter, bludgeoned while held in his mother's arms. Elaine gave birth during the assault. The newborn was unalived as well. It was not just an unalive, it was an annihilation. For years, the crime defied explanation. Some believed Keith had lost his mind and eliminated his own family. No suspect was arrested. No evidence linked anyone to the scene. Then, years later, Tommy Lindsels claimed responsibility. He said Keith had invited him into the home to play music. He said something snapped, but there was no proof, just his word. And his word, by then, had become a toxic mixture of truth and fiction, impossible to separate. He did not unalive with precision or calculation. He unalived like a storm. There was no consistency in his methods. Sometimes it was a sharp object, other times a fire weapon. Sometimes he strangled. Sometimes he beat. There was no signature, no psychological profile that could contain his unpredictability. Most serial life-takers operate with ritual. Tommy Lindsell's operated with impulse. That distinction led the FBI to classify him as a spree life-taker, a title that marked him as even more dangerous than his more infamous counterparts. He didn't wait between life-taking. There were no cooling-off periods. When the urge emerged, he obeyed it without delay. He could unalive twice in a day or vanish for weeks. There was no script, only chaos. What made Tommy Lindsell's even more terrifying was the sheer randomness of his attacks. He didn't stalk victims for weeks or learn their routines. He would meet them by chance, sometimes at a gas station, sometimes at a carnival, sometimes through a church. The encounter could last minutes, and if the switch flipped in his mind, they would die. And their deaths would be brutal. There was no warning, no slow escalation, just sudden, devastating violence. People who welcomed him into their homes, people who gave him food, offered him kindness, were often those who paid the ultimate price. But even monsters make mistakes. On the night of December 31st, 1999, Tommy Lindsell's crossed a line he could not erase. In Del Rio, Texas, 13-year-old Kayleen Harris and her friend Crystal Searles were having a sleepover. Tommy had met Kayleen's family through a church event and had been invited into their orbit of trust. That trust was shattered when, sometime after 4 a.m., he broke into the home and attacked the girls with a sharp object. Kayleen died from a slit throat. Crystal's throat was cut as well, but she survived. Bloodied and gasping, she managed to crawl to a neighbor's house. That single act of endurance became the beginning of his end. Crystal Searles, only 10 years old, became the voice that law enforcement needed. Despite the trauma, she gave a detailed description. A sketch was made. The face that emerged from her memory was Tommy Lindsell's. He was arrested shortly after. At first, he denied everything. Then, like a dam breaking, the confessions poured out. He claimed responsibility for dozens of murders. He described crime scenes with unsettling detail. He mapped routes, recalled names. But he also contradicted himself, invented stories, and attempted to inflate his own legend. Investigators struggled to distinguish fact from fiction. He may have murdered as few as 22 or as many as 70. The truth drowned in his lies. He was convicted of the life-taking of Kayleen Harris in 2000 and sentenced to death. Crystal Searles testified against him with astonishing courage. Her voice shook, but her words were roars of truth. She looked him in the eye and refused to break. Her testimony sealed his fate. And yet, Tommy Lindsell's thrived in the spotlight of notoriety. On death row, he continued spinning his web of contradictions, confessing one day, recanting the next, feeding journalists with half-truths and riddles. He relished control. It was not enough to unalive. He had to be remembered. But eventually, even the most attention-hungry predators are silenced. On April 3, 2014, Tommy Lindsell's was executed by lethal injection at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. He declined to give a final statement. The man who had never stopped talking, who had written his own myth in blood, died in silence. No screams, no confession, just an end. Even after his death, the echo of his terror lingered. Law enforcement reopened cold cases, hoping to finally close the doors he had left open. Some families found closure. Others found only more questions. For many, the horror lay not just in the life-takings, but in the random chance of it all, the unbearable thought that their loved ones were not targeted for a reason, but simply caught in the blast radius of a wandering executioner. Tommy Lindsell's act of life-taking was without reason, without remorse, and without method. That made him more than a monster. It made him an anomaly, one that America is still struggling to understand. Tommy Lynn Sells remains one of the most terrifying murderers in modern criminal history, not because he was the most prolific or the most cunning, but because he represented something far more disturbing: the absence of reason. He unalived not for money or revenge or lust. He unalived because something inside him was broken beyond repair, and every act of unalive was another shattered shard of that brokenness made manifest in the world. He was not a criminal genius or a dreaded artist of death. He was chaos wearing human skin, and for nearly 2 decades, that chaos slipped through the veins of America, staining everything it touched. His story is not just a cautionary tale. It is a mirror reflecting the darkest possibilities of human nature. And while the name Tommy Lynn Sells may never be as famous as other life-takers, the carnage he wrought, senseless, spontaneous, and soul-crushing, will never be forgotten by those who survived his storm or were left to bury its victims. Do you think the true number of his victims will ever be known? Was Tommy Lynn Sells driven by trauma, or was he born with nothing but destruction inside? Could someone like him slip through the cracks again in today's world? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more unfiltered dives into the minds of history's darkest figures, subscribe now.